This program is part of Lift Every Voice, Why African American Poetry Matters, a national public humanities initiative of Library of America presented in partnership with the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, with generous support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and Emerson Collective. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last installment of Black Poetry Fest, a series of virtual programming brought to you by Fulton County Library System and Lift Every Voice, a program by Library of Americas. Today, we're talking with Ryan J., a spoken word artist, poet, and writer, and we're going to start this session with a reading from African American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle and Song, edited by Kevin Young. Today we're reading Evie Shockley's Statistical Haiku, or How Did They Discount Us? Let Me Count the Ways. Only 3 of 100 black boys entering kindergarten will graduate college. In the night sky, shooting stars. Every day a black person under 20 years old commits suicide. Plucked magnolia blossoms, funereal perfume. A black man is 700% more likely than a white man to be sentenced to prison. Scattered thunder showers in May. Every 3 minutes, a black child is born into poverty. Pine needles line the forest floor. There are many ways to look at the world. Ways we can envision truth so that it becomes real in our lives. This poem makes black suffering feel as tangible as numbers. The haiku form allows for the stark lines of injustices to fully permeate the mind and heart. We talked to Ryan about how time reshapes the context of our lives and work, and the importance of poetry in its relation to the internal black experience. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Ryan, and we'll see you on the other side. Hello, Fulton County. Welcome back to the last installment of Black Poetry Fest. We are here with Ryan J., the incomparable, the wonderful, high energy, super warm spirited poet, spoken word artist, poetry advocate in the community, just a general all-around great person. We're going to hear some poems, then we're going to talk a little bit. I'm really excited for everyone to hear this. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Ryan. So Ryan J. is a Mercer University alumnus who holds a bachelor's degree in environmental engineering and a master's degree in engineering management. Ryan began performing spoken word in 2012 and hasn't turned back since. In 2018, Ryan became a Cave Canem Fellow, the 2018 Art Amok Slam Poetry Slam Champion, and placed 13th in the world for spoken word at the Individual World Poetry Slam. Ryan is currently based in Atlanta, Georgia, and is dedicated to community and youth outreach through spoken word and other performative arts. You may also recognize Ryan from the season 2 finale of BET's The Quad, NPR's City Lights, TED Atlanta, or as one part of the duo Nobody Likes Us, But We're Here Anyway, with Nate Mask, a fellow Atlanta-based spoken word artist. Ryan's poems are swagged out, lyrical constructions. Ryan is infectious in his delivery and tone, and the warmth of his words fill the room as he performs. The depth of his work creeps up on the listener and settles on his audience like a welcome spirit. His wit and finesse are gifts he wields. He makes art look easy, fun, and life-changing in his hands. And with that, I'm gonna hand it to you. Excited to hear you read.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much, Nicholas, for that beautiful introduction. And yeah, I'm super excited to be here with y'all, and super excited to share my poems with y'all. Definitely. So started writing a chapbook back in 2018 about my father and myself, and our relationship with one another. Um, and in 2020, I became a father. So I kind of have been like revisiting that work with a new perspective from when I originally wrote it. So I think I'm going to read some poems that kind of speak to that relationship between me and my father, and then also that, that I'm kind of working through right now. So um, I'll start off with this poem. It is called Affirmation. The white kids used to say you weren't black if your daddy was at home. So I guess it was seventh grade I turned real black. Blacker than the insides of closed eyelids and caskets. Stepdaddy lost his life in my search for affirmation, curled his spine into balled fists in my pocket, folded his voice into the poems in my notebook. Stepdaddy found his wings in my blackness, dapped up St. Peter like grown niggas do. Daddy still ain't called yet. He ain't as black as me. His daddy dropped everything for him. Daddy dropped me for everything. I don't think he believes me, son. Instead, colors me a black void like midnights without him. Named me Shadow. Found joy in the way I could never separate myself from him, but in how easily he could separate himself from me. The white kid still brand me Oreo. Tried to pretend stepdaddy didn't die for my birthright, and daddy didn't sacrifice me for mine. Like black ain't some shit both daddies owe me to make up for the parts of me they couldn't love, they weren't able to love, to make up for me. Black Boy in Monologue 1, based on the prayer over a bottle of tequila. My father was a little rough around the edges, but who wouldn't be after growing up a throbbing cavity in the slack jaw of Social Circle, Georgia? The boonies, he would call it. Mama would often weave legend about the trouble he'd get in around town, always careful about when to thread herself into the seams of his mischief, as if Nana would personally ask God to send a lightning bolt her way for every truth Mama never told her. She always made sure to mention how Dad would never raise more than a bottle for the block boys and never less than a fist at any white man who threatened anyone in the community. She even taught me a prayer they chant in bars while drinking shots of tequila that I use whenever my white friends invite me to the club. It goes, "Oh Lord, hallowed be this bottle. Bless this vessel so that upon its consumption, I may reap a fistful of teeth from the mouth of any white man formed against me. Make it so. Loosen their tongues so they may be easier to wrangle, Lord. Warn them not of my wrath or the way my righteousness will clog their throats and intervene their speech. May thy will be done, Lord, with my fists in this bar as it is in heaven. Amen." After picking up my hair off the floor in Matthew's bathroom. I wonder if he's ever found himself this way, bent knee and bowed head, searching for himself in a space that does not belong to him. I can hear my hands begin to kink, wrapping the thick of themselves around the parts of me I hadn't kept track of, even as Matthew's split ends hug the baseboards and clog his drains. I think of how he just combs his hair and leaves the pieces of him wherever he wants, and how he won't notice the amount of labor it took to remove the curl of me, how he'll assume that this is how the bathroom has always been, porcelain white and free from coarseness. Smoke, haiku in series. It's August 18th, it's my birthday, and my dad becomes candle smoke, which is to say that I'll always wish him into someone he can't be. Mom claims I look like him. I thought my reflection looked like an absence, the sort of empty you can only find in the words he uses. The word love rattles my ribcage when it comes from his lips. I doubt it. Or maybe he means the way you love breathing, that you're supposed to. There's no asking why, just the rise of chest and lung, exhale of a name he barely uses. He calls me son, and sometimes I ask him which son he is speaking to. It can't be me, the leftover ash, dust, byproduct of his smoldering neglect. Or maybe it is I, the boy phoenix, once again risen from the promises that he could not keep to me. Once again, the one reason you could tell that he was here in the first place, the only body tying the ghost of him to this earth, the only body, once again, wishing smoke be visible and be dad again. Cats in the cradle. Sorry, this is a lot of like me going in on my dad. I apologize, but we're here. Cats in the cradle. Sometimes I say my dad's name in the mirror, once in the morning and once before I go to sleep. It's kind of become a ritual, something I don't even realize I'm doing. between the brush of a wisdom tooth or the scrub of a washcloth against cheekbone, John. Daddy moved to Texas last month. I think he thinks himself better there, remembers what it was like to grow up young stallion without reins in San Antonio. I scrub my cheek, John. They say police officers are a whole nother thing in Texas. They say they can't tell black skin from asphalt down there. I think about how Daddy said he was retiring from the police force, how he said he was tired of the badge, and it is only now that I forget what privilege tastes like. Back molars now, scrub, John. He tells me over the phone he wants me to visit when I can. I tell him I will. He promises another fishing trip. I can hear the river in his voice. Forehead scrub, John. I played the song Cats in the Cradle after helping him pack his moving truck. When you coming home, Dad? I don't know when. Scrub, John. I'm afraid I'm starting to look like him now. Mom's been saying that for years. I don't know if she means the way I can't follow through or that I have one of his ears. Scrub, John. When you coming home, son? I don't know when. Scrub, John. I think the last time we've exchanged I love yous, and I think of the last time we exchanged I love yous, and I remember feeling a funeral escape my throat. I remember my tongue being pallbearer for his name, Scrub. We'll be together then, my dad, John. Skin breaks. I know we'll have a good time then. Let's see. What do we want to do now? Okay. So I did this podcast with a friend about a month ago, and I think the episode is supposed to be premiering this month in February. So I'm going to read the piece from that. Hopefully the episode comes out sooner rather than later, so it doesn't look like I'm giving y'all stuff I'm not supposed to give y'all. So, okay. So the premise of this podcast is that a poet or a writer is given a prompt. They write a piece for the prompt, and then they're assigned, or they give the piece that the poet or the writer wrote to two artists unaffiliated with that writer, and those two artists have to create art from that piece. So it's like ekphrastic work almost. So yeah, this is the poem that I wrote, and my prompt was 50-50. They say the odds of a Black person surviving to the age of 30 are about the same as flipping a quarter and having it lands heads up. 50-50. Today, a Black person lands heads down, tumbles through the air like a quarter on a mission, and finds their way into the fingers of an expectant earth. And it makes sense. Both are bodies that we only give value after they've been cast in metal. Both are things this country has collected for years. Both are ideas only celebrated when they're in your possession, when you feel the name belongs to you, when you can no longer hear the sound of their voice or the echoes of their laughter. No one celebrates a quarter when it has no worth to them. No one speaks a quarter's name before it's been spent. No one acknowledges its value before it lands in their open palms and closed eyes, my mom says. My mom says, God hides his blessing behind closed eyes and open palms. And now I'm just wondering if that's why graveyards have always felt like churches, a congregation of people in infinite wait for their blessings. And maybe they've already received them. A ticket to the rapture feels a lot like a blessing now. Feels a lot like an escape from all this pain, this suffering, this turn up for the homies who can't be, turn up for the homies while they're here, they chant. My boys, all 27 now, gathered around the Henny like it has a story to tell, drowning their sorrows and the love of their brothers in each flick of a glass. We're getting old, I shout. Just imagine we're almost 30. And they shout back, voices spinning through the air like a quarter about to land. Don't make it sound like a death sentence. Let's see. Cool. We'll get into this next one. When they ask you what you're running away from, boy, you will answer in the only way you know how. The empty space between lovers, two islands floating in the open sea of a double bed, words, volcanic ash, and sprinkled around the space of one another. The eruption, the stagnation, how it feels to know you meant what you said, and what you said being the end of a civilization, of a space that has cradled you in the rockiest of tides. When they ask what you're running away from, boy, you will answer in the only way you know how. An empty plate, downturned eyes, the whispered questions, The silence that clings to the scalp after the echo fades and the lights have gone dim, the look of satisfaction on your mother's face when you tell her you're finally giving up on your dreams. When they ask you what you're running away from, boy, you will answer in the only way you know how. The dog's grave in the front yard, the way Uncle Eric's name sloughs off Grandma's lips after the funeral, the promise of no more Aretha Franklin, Prince, and Michael Jackson albums, the recall of a forgotten name when they've been out of sight for too long. When they ask what you're running away from, boy, you will answer in the best way you know how. Myself, you, this life, the way it claims all it can offer, the way it claims it can offer you everything and nothing at the same time, the way it promises that it will love you until it doesn't, and how you have no control over that, and how you are at the mercy of stardust and a God with lazy eyes. But God, my legs are tired, running is exhausting. Never looking back is hard. Avoiding mirrors, families, and lovers, it's inconvenient. And when does it stop? When is it okay to say you love yourself enough to confront what scares you? Is it now? Is it here? Is it in this moment? Then I think I've got one more poem. Is that okay? Cool. Awesome. One more. Kudzu. From Wikipedia. Kudzu is a family of perennial vines native to much of East and Southeastern Asia. In areas where these plants are naturalized, they can be invasive and considered noxious weeds, climbing over trees or shrubs and growing so rapidly that it kills them by heavy shading. Kudzu was introduced from Japan into the United States in 1876. It has since spread over millions of acres in the southern United States. I wonder what it's like to resent a thing that you have entrusted to the earth. My parents wake up seedfuls of regrets. Sow each of my siblings' names into the soil and water them with their failed pursuits, a bale of college credits, empty corporate desks, vacant wall space, and demand that they grow from the lessons they've learned. My grandmother had a dream once, and then out of the sky fell my mother, planted herself where all of Granny's whispers grew. Sometimes I imagine having children, and I think of my mom at my age, 25 and blooming a garden of constant attention, unable to pull away. My dad sees a forest of accomplishments, remarks, I had aspirations once, and each word sounds like a gasp for air. What am I saying? I think Joan's children have always been kudzu. I would say this is all just speculation, but I've seen the way my parents search the tree line for what could have been and force a smile for the uncontrollable growth, for the peaks of bark through the sleeping vine. My girlfriend says she wants to tell me something, and instinctually, I think of how small a tree I am, how she herself is nothing more than a sprig. And when it isn't that, I don't know what to do with myself. It's just funny to me. I've always imagined being a father, so much so that I'll wear his clothes, tell his jokes, and have been a better support system to the kids who look up to me than he ever was. And yet, I can't imagine being a father right now. I don't ever want my children to suffocate me the way I have my parents. I never want to have to grit and smile through raising them. I want my children to know that I'll love them into whatever vegetation they wish to be. Tree, shrub, bush, fucking flora be damned, fucking kudzu be damned. When I have kids, I want both of us to be able to see the sun and never regret it. Thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. I also really am into like the baby crying in the background while you talk about father figure. It's like 3 generations at once. It's really
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. So yeah, I was like, okay, background, we'll take it. That's fine.
Cool background. Multimedia performance. So-
Well, and it's funny. When I was pulling up stuff to look at, to read, I pulled up this piece and I was like, man, again, I wrote this like 2 years ago or 3 years or almost 3 years ago at this point, and I'm like, I'm in such a different space than I was when I wrote at least that last poem, right,
yeah,
with the new stuff, and like where I talk about not being able to imagine being a father, and then here I am now
right.
with a baby and like being excited about that and like and being okay with that is just I don't know that I would have imagined myself in that space, so very interesting to me.
Well, it's interesting because that poem can be true and that feeling is true. Um, and even if you wrote that poem like today, you could honor like the truth in that and still
Yeah.
have a, you know,
Right.
uh,
Right. Right.
that's like a thing poetry can do, is like um, uh, allow for this like contradictions to exist
Right.
in like a
Right.
really beautiful way.
Yeah. We're all messy people, and I think poetry allows for the mess. Yeah. That's.
Yeah, we celebrate the mess.
Well, yeah.
That's I was like, that's really the brand.
Yeah.
Uh,
Truly. Like.
yeah, I want to talk about um, hearing that you revisited these poems. So the theme of the like the very loose theme for your segment is about memory, revisiting poems that you had in that chapbook from where you are now. What was that process like? How'd that, not necessarily how you feel as a person, but as an artist, making work, maybe editing or making new work. What was your instinct when you revisited this?
Yeah. I'll say I wrote this chapbook uh, mid 2018, and this was like I quit my job in engineering in 2017, going into 2018 to pursue a career in poetry, and I did that for a year before I went back to engineering. But during that year, I wrote this book because I was like, this chapbook. I was like alone, not necessarily like alone. There were people around me, but I was like, I had a lot of time to myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a lot of time to do a lot of introspection, and so I realized I had like a lot of like unresolved feelings with my father that like really colored the rest of my relationships in a way that I didn't think it was doing. And so when I wrote this, I was like, okay, I'm going to deal with all this, right? I'm just going to deal with it. I'm going to get it out on paper, and this is going to be it. I'm going to send it to him. That's what the original goal was. I'm going to send it to him, and I'm going to like get it out to him, and I want him to like know how I'm feeling, and then and I can tell you this story maybe a little bit later, but um, I was reading a poem that I wrote about him in his town at a show that he ended up showing up to, that I didn't I knew he was going to show up to, but I wasn't going to read that poem if he showed up on time, and then he didn't show up on time, so I didn't think he was going to come, and so I read it, and I had at that point I was thrust into this moment where I had to like kind of reconcile my feelings with him in a way that I didn't necessarily want to, but I
I'm
was like
so sorry.
forced to. Yeah.
Uh,
It was when I tell you it was messy, and like I'll tell you the story. I really will at some point in time, but or maybe even during the course of this conversation. But yeah, it was just so messy in a way that like just like threw me, and so like at that moment, I think that was like the moment I started realizing that again we're not all black and white.
mhm.
That sometimes we are gray, and sometimes we are messy, and sometimes I think people do things in order to like get by and get to the next day, and don't necessarily realize they're doing those things like don't necessarily realize that those things that they're doing are harming other people. Like
Right.
I think and so like that was something that I had to realize applied to parents too, because I think we grow up thinking that our parents are these like infallible people that aren't able to make any mistakes whatsoever. And I think realizing that my dad, I needed to pull him down from this pedestal I had set him upon. I think I set him upon that pedestal as like a oh, he's an unattainable like person or thought. And so like I aspire so much to like be around him, to be his son, and then like realizing that like he's just trying to get by and do his day-to-day thing, and like he still loves me, but it's just sometimes things don't work out the way we want them to. And so like I think that started coloring the way I started viewing my art, because so much of my art is connected to my dad,
Right.
and so much of the work I've written over the past it'll be 10 years next year that I've been writing.
Okay.
In the past 10 years has been connected to him and to our relationship. So like I I'm going back through the entirety of my work and being like, I don't feel this same way anymore. And
Yeah.
this is difficult. And this is hard. Like like you said before, I think we can respect the work regardless of when it was written, but like that's not it's weird. It's like looking at an old picture of yourself after you've maybe gained a bunch of muscle or lost a bunch of weight, and you're like, I don't know that person.
Right.
um, and so I think it's weird. And also like being in this space of like being a new father and trying to navigate my relationship with fatherhood and making sure that like my relationship to my son is better than my relationship to my dad was, is like, looking at this work, I'm like, there's so much hurt here, and I never want to inflict that upon anybody else. So like, how can I one, make sure my relationships in, now in the present and like in real life are like that, and then how can I convey that in my work? And it's been so difficult, when I tell you,
Yeah.
and to try to like get that on the paper of of that healing and document that healing on paper. It's so much harder than documenting the pain. And I think that's like a reality that poetry kind of exists in. And that like, I think it's really easy to sit down and be like, you hurt me this way, this way, this way, this way, metaphor, flowery language, this is beautiful. And it's so much more difficult to sit down and be like, you know what, like this makes me happy, and how does this make me happy, and like what does it mean to be happy, and like what does happiness look like? I think it's difficult, so it's difficult on both ends, reanalyzing this work and going back through this work, and then also navigating new work. And my relationship to both of those things is, yeah, it's difficult, but it's been rewarding so far, I'll say.
And I would think, like you're saying, like it's difficult to recognize yourself in these poems because it's not necessarily how you feel anymore. I
Right.
also think the process of writing the poems is a healing act in itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, so you could go, um, as a for instance, like if you wrote those poems and still didn't have I don't know what the T is, like, but you don't have to be present to reconcile with your father to do the healing. The
Right.
work of the poems does the healing. So that makes sense that you would look back and be like, well, I feel like I've made peace with this mode. uh,
Yeah.
I'm on to something else.
Yeah.
um
And I think what's hard for me to recognize in that, because I agree with you
mm,
100%. I think what's difficult for me in that is that I've written so many poems like, like that exist in that space, that I'm like, oh, so wait, you mean it's okay not to feel the same way afterwards, and
mm,
not to consistently exist in that space?
yeah.
um and I mean, that's what healing is, right? To move on from, and to grow from those spaces. But like, I existed in that space for so long that it's like, okay, word. Yeah.
And like, who are you as an artist without that now?
That, listen, it's that, right? It's that, my relationship with my father. And then I think a lot about, I realized really early on that a lot of my poems are colored by my experience as a Black man, right? And um particularly about police brutality, there was like a very, very large stretch where that's like all I wrote about in different ways.
Mhm.
And I spent like the better part of the past few years to like try to not necessarily stop writing about that stuff, but to remove myself from it in a way that felt like I was doing myself some justice, like allowing space for myself in my work, because I felt like maybe I had crowded myself out of that. So like, yeah, I started asking myself, yeah, who am I without daddy issues, and without like consistently and continuously thinking about the fact that Black people are, that often die at the hands of injustice, you know, and boy, like that's been a conversation,
Yeah, it's like what you said, like you're like, okay, well, I'm happy now, so what are we
Yeah,
gonna do? What what do
yeah,
we do? But living in poems where like I like recently worked on a project where I was like spending weeks writing about like grief through these exercises. And I was like, I was like, normally my grieving process is not this like painful, but I'm choosing to live in it. And that like it's a different feeling.
right, right,
And it feels like a duty as an artist to honor that. But it's important to recognize too that like art doesn't have to be painful.
right, right, right.
I tried to explain that. I was talking to someone and I was like, yeah, you know how like it's just like really painful to do, and they're like, it doesn't. No, it doesn't have to be that. I was like,
Yeah,
okay, you say
if
so.
you're harming yourself in this,
You
you might
don't
be
have
doing
to.
it wrong. Yeah,
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 you're doing it wrong. You don't have to hurt. You don't have to.
right, right,
Um,
exactly.
well, this translates into. Oh, and before we leave that too, I'll say for the audience too, and like I heard someone say writing about, and it was I think they were talking about their mother. They said writing about your mother, like or your problems with someone, doesn't mean that you don't love them, and
Right,
it's not a betrayal to them. And I
right,
think it's important for artists to remember that like these subjects are fair game.
right,
If you come from a place of, and it works best when you come from a place of love to do that kind of criticism, and you could feel that in
right,
your poems. Like it never felt. It's not a hate thing. It's a trying to find what the connection is thing.
right.
An earnest digging for that.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's a great example of that.
I appreciate that.
Henri, I guess kind of, no, well, next transition. So I know a lot of your other work too uh, is hilarious. You're very funny
Thank
as a poet. What is the role of humor in your poetry, or like what do you value in using humor as a tool?
Yeah. So I'm sorry y'all didn't get any of that
I
this
was like,
time
oh,
around.
I guess we're not doing any happy ones.
If time allows, if there's a little bit of space a little bit later, I'll try to go back and read something funny if that's cool with you. But
Okay.
yeah, if time allows, just so y'all can have that. But no, I think it's very interesting. I was there's like a bunch of memes floating around about this and a bunch of Twitter threads floating around about it. But like I think like blackness exists, and I know I'm speaking about the role of humor in my work, but because my work is so entangled with blackness, it feels appropriate to speak about this. But I feel like blackness exists in such close proximity to like comedy that like it's just it feels natural in that way where it's like if something's serious, like I don't know that there's ever been a topic that I've like been able to just like be straight faced about with like friends and family
Yeah.
that like even if it's like dead serious, it could be like serious as all get out. Even like I think about not to get too political on your excuse me during the during this talk, but like
Yeah. I'll say, yeah, certain events that I'll just say what date it is. Today. Uh, I'll say we're in January right now.
okay,
Going to like Black Twitter immediately when I hear something like that could be devastating. I was like, I gotta go like
oh yeah, oh
like
yeah. And it was just like it's like we're all talking about it, like there's serious dialogue that's happening, but in like the undertone of that is like comedy. People are just guffawing, laughing, and it's like and it brings a certain like levity to the topics as we're discussing them. It kind of, even though things may look dismal or things may look bad or hopeless in some shape, form, or fashion, that comedy, when it's injected in there, really like I feel like gives you a sense of hope, even if you don't necessarily like think that's what you're getting. That's kind of what you're getting, right? It's like you're like, oh, okay, at the end of the day, I may be experiencing like things that are negative or hard or like very difficult to work through, but I know I can still laugh.
mhm.
I can still laugh through this.
Yeah.
And like and I feel like being able to laugh at I don't want to say tragedy, but like tragedy and like the human condition really, yeah, just kind of adds a little injection of hope that you didn't you realize that you wanted or needed. And then also makes like the work relatable, right? Is like I can I imagine, right? I just read 10 minutes of like stuff that's kind of heavy, but reading 10 minutes of things that is incredibly heavy, uh, you relate to that entirely differently than you do if you're reading things that like are reading 10 minutes of something that's like heavy and also makes you laugh. It's like, okay, word, like I got something different from that than I did from other work, and I feel like being able to use humor in that way for me really allows me to connect to people. Um, yeah, and that's kind of what I look for when I'm doing that. I'm like, okay, if I can laugh at this, I imagine somebody else can laugh at this,
Yeah.
and like, that'll allow them to relate to, the work in a way that maybe they didn't think they could relate to it before. So
And I think you use it on like smaller scales, even in those serious works, like to like puns or like turns of phrases. Like the premise of that one with the uh, it's not like ha ha funny, but it's like the idea of like the coin flipping, like
yeah,
up or down. This man laid face down. Like it's a punchline to like setup, and I
right,
think those help with relatability. It's easy for the reader to understand your trajectory.
right,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's a great skill to be able to use even in your serious work.
Yeah, well, thank you, one, and then yeah, I think it's yeah, I yeah, it's just so much of poetry too. I'll add, like, misses, not misses, but like doesn't have that, doesn't include that, and which I think the the poetry community at large. Yes, the baby is back. I feel like the poetry community at large kind of like expects its audience to exist in a space where like we're like real somber and like, like we're kind of like these high level thinkers that like humor doesn't, unless it's like really like academic, high level humor, we're not going to get it, or we don't, we won't laugh at it. But like, I feel like poetry readers are people too, and and people kind of need that, and whatever they're watching or enjoying. I think even if you think about dramas, right? I think about any other form of media. If you're watching like a very very serious movie, or like even like a dramatic TV show, there are still those moments, right, where it's like, they inject that like little bit of humor in there, and you're like, oh word, I needed this like breaks up the weight of everything, and allows me to immerse myself in it a little bit further and to relate to the characters and to the people. So why not bring that to poetry? You know what I mean?
Right. On a craft level, just to use that tool and not be afraid of it for prestige purposes or anything like that.
Yeah, yeah,
I'll say too, I was thinking when you were talking about using humor, I was just going to reiterate how you said hope. And I was thinking, like, why is it hopeful? And I think it just shows another. Um, I wonder if it, like, first of all, in a Black space, do you like, we trust that everyone understands the gravity of it. There's a trust thing. Like, if you're going to go on here and make this joke, you also know that this is like
a serious thing.
thing.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and you're offering new points of view on something that otherwise could have only been looked at as tragic. And so
right,
maybe that's like the optimistic or the hopeful part of it, or it's just escapism.
right.
Um,
Fair, yeah.
it could
But,
just be
yeah.
either.
At the end of the day, that's all it could be.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah.
um, so when you're talking about, I did want to talk to you about spoken word versus
Yeah.
other forms of poetry. Uh, how would you define spoken word?
I personally view it as poetry written specifically for performance.
Mhm.
Um, I think that's actually that's probably the best way I could put it.
I think,
It yeah,
I think
yeah,
that's it.
yeah. Is because I was going to add some more stuff, and I was like, well, I'm just going to say the same thing again in different words. But yeah, poetry written specifically for performance. I think you can have uh, poems that you think are spoken word but aren't really spoken word, because there's not that performative aspect to it. It's just a poem you're reading on stage.
Right.
And so yeah, I think because there's that like theatrical aspect to spoken word, that kind of differentiates it from your traditional like written word and page poetry. um at least that's what the community calls it, is page poetry or page poems.
I thought
uh
that, yeah, that's
yeah,
it. Like, there's a connection between, I think, like, it's not just Black poetry. I think, like, Black culture holds a space for spoken word. What's that relationship?
Yeah, so you know, I don't know. And like in a way that like I don't know that there's like a particular moment that you can say like, oh, this is when spoken word became like a thing for Black Americans or for Black people in general. Because like you said, I think it's almost always been a thing. I think of I and this might I might be wrong about this, but I think it ties in particular to our to the way that Black people have been telling each other's histories and stories for so long, is that like we very much rely on oral tradition in order in like even in our every like day-to-day like interactions with each other. But like yeah, oral tradition has been such like a big part of like the Black community and the way we exist and the way we remember, that I think like spoken word just kind of like is like, oh, okay, word, we can like we already we're writing and we're like is it existing in these artistic spaces, like it just makes sense to kind of like branch off of that and add our kind of like merge two art forms of like oral storytelling and like this like poetic art form that we're kind of like delving into, and it's weird how it exists in its, I think how it exists in its proximity to hip hop too.
Yeah.
um I think like so many people, including myself, come to spoken word from a like hip hop background. Like I very much thought I could rap when I first started
I was
writing
gonna
poems.
ask. I was gonna assume that you had a rap career that I didn't know about.
Oh, listen, I got a mixtape, Nicholas.
Okay. Don't be scared. Drop the link.
SoundCloud when I drop it. No, but like, yeah, I know I personally came to spoken word from a place where I was like, oh yeah, I can rap. I've been doing that with my friends for so long, and that's like something I know how to do. And then realizing like, okay, I'm an okay rapper, but I'm like so much better at like again communicating stories and poems and like my feelings and perspectives through this like other medium that isn't necessarily hip hop but is adjacent to hip hop.
Mhm.
um and I think and I think modern spoken word has really like exploited that like that relationship with hip hop.
Mhm.
um I think about like um particularly Def Poetry Jam,
Right.
and like how people kind of like traverse that line and go back and forth between hip hop and spoken word, and like at least now, or at least in the early 2000s to now, really like came into play as like this way for people who were traditionally like cemented in hip hop to like kind of like branch out and to expand into these like other areas. But that's not to say that the prominent spoken word artists are hip hop artists, because that's not true at all.
Right.
um but I think it's come into popularity because of that, though, because of that relationship between the two.
I think you're right. And I was also thinking about when you said it's an oral tradition, um, even before hip hop or before like I'm thinking I've heard of like even back in like slave days, a way to like entertain would be like someone would just like tell stories and just like tell tall tales, just like how can you deliver words in a way that gives something to a community.
Yeah. Yeah.
Literally, we just always have done it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Um, yeah, but no, to kind of go off of what you were saying about, yes, like slave tradition and like, or the tradition of enslaved peoples. Yeah, I agree right there too. And like, who's to say that wasn't spoken word, and like, like some of that stuff wasn't spoken word, and like, who am I to say that those people weren't like spoken word artists, especially since I think so much of the culture that they generated has informed like the culture after that existed, and so on and so forth, and even informs like the issues that we experience today too, right? And so it's like, I think it's very hard to, I feel like, extrapolate moments where we can say like, oh, here is a moment where spoken word became a thing.
Yeah.
You know, because like you said, it's kind of always existed as a thing. Now I will say that's entirely different than slam poetry. But slam poetry, and that's primarily when I was performing full time and when and prior to the pandemic.
Right.
Or I would say I kind of stopped doing slam the year before the pandemic because a bunch of stuff happened. But yeah, prior to the pandemic, I was like primarily doing slam. I would have considered myself first and foremost a slam poet or a slam artist or whatever, and then a poet, and then and then a spoken word artist, and then a poet, and then a writer. You know, in the hierarchy of description. But so slam is particularly like the art of performing spoken word for competition, and it's done in a very like unique way where there aren't really experts. Like the whole idea of slam, and I think this goes back to what we were talking about humor and relatability, and why I think I wield it and people I know wield humor in their work in a way that like in an attempt to relate to people. Slam asks the average ordinary layperson to come in and judge poems, and kind of like deeming the crowd the expert regardless of whether or not they've been to a bunch of poetry slams. I think we actually encourage more often than not people who haven't been to a poetry slam or whose first time judging, like to come and judge and do stuff like that. So it kind of requires that you relate to people and that you like build a rapport with the audience and exist in that space where like you can draw them in and also say something serious, or maybe not. I have poems about mac and cheese, you know what I mean? And like
But that mac and cheese has like subtext that's like very
that's true. You're right. You're very correct.
yeah, I was like, oh, I remember that poem. That was when I was like, all right, I really like Ryan's pretty great. I want to ask about, so I guess like thinking about slam, uh, making collaborative work as a writer. Uh, what's it like? I know you work with Nate a lot, and y'all's partnership is like I don't see that with writers, that it's like, oh, like we're a duo, we're together, we're doing like we're making work, we're performing it, we're informing each other. What's that like?
Yeah. I'll say first and foremost, it can be, if you don't share a particular type of relationship with the person that you're working with, it can be kind of difficult. But Nate and I, before we became like the Nobody Likes Us duo, and we haven't really performed as the Nobody Likes Us duo in a while, but before we became that duo, we were friends first and foremost, and like built a relationship kind of like outside of poetry. Like sure, we existed in the same spaces because of poetry, and like that's like the of course the umbrella to all of our interactions, but we kind of became friends not because of the poems. Like sure, we liked each other's work, but like it was so much more than that. And I think because of that, we were kind of able to just like sit down and do a lot of like rapping about like what we wanted to write about. And it's like, oh, like I think Nate and I have this poem about Mario Kart and drunk driving, and as like a don't do it for the kids. And we both kind of just like thinking about that, right? We both kind of just sat there and we're like, you know what? What would be wild? It's like Mario Kart's kind of like drunk, and kind of and stuff like So it's cool being in a space where you can kind of like bounce ideas off of with somebody that makes good work on their own and also appreciates your work and like kind of has a beat on where you're headed and like what you're doing. And like it was when I was existing in that space with Nate, it was a very generative space. Like we were like creating a lot of stuff. We were like coming up with new ideas a lot. That isn't to say we didn't have our times where we didn't see eye to eye on things, and where, you know, again, where maybe I thought a piece was going one direction, or I thought an idea was going one direction, and then he turned around and thought it was going a different direction, and we had our disagreements there. Of course, that we definitely had those times too, but I think, you know, when you have that relationship with somebody prior to, you know, creating that sort of like partnership with them, you know, it really creates something special. And I'll add to, not to talk too long, but I'll add to that, spoken word kind of lends itself to that a lot, and that the because it's so heavily centered on the theatrical and on the drama and on the performance, you know, there are often, you know, times where we'll form, like, we have the National Poetry Slam every year. We didn't have it last year because of COVID, but you know, where they'll have like the National Poetry Slam and they'll form teams and they'll write group pieces with those teams and et cetera. And I think, you know, that really, you don't really get that a lot of other, in a lot of other art spaces, other than, I think dance is, if I could compare it to anything, I think that, to me, I would compare it probably the most to dance, because right, where it's like you're you know, you're choreographing this like large, like, you know, showing of like your talents and like how you play off of one another, and how your bodies and your words and your like your auras kind of like interact with one
Yeah.
another, stuff like that, and to create something that maybe you wouldn't have been able to create by yourself,
And
you
you
know.
learn a lot about yourself
Oh
through
yeah, so
as an artist is insane.
yeah.
Well, it sounds fun. Like with Nate, it's like you when people are like riffing with their best friend, like, and y'all are like laughing about something way too long and going back and forth.
Yeah,
Uh, but in the world of like spoken word, that's how a poem's made.
right,
Uh,
right.
so that's
Yeah,
just exciting.
yeah,
And then I need to ask you about poetry as outreach. So
yeah.
I'm interested in what work you do, and then um, after I hear about that, I probably want to talk about what's poetry's purpose uh, to um, the world beyond like the initial poetry audience.
But yeah, so poetry is outreach, prior to, again, prior to the pandemic that shut everything down, and probably a year prior to that, I was like coaching teams for the College Union's Poetry Slam Invitational.
Mhm.
So really, so I would go to, I coached for Mercer University and for University of Georgia, and then like had a very, 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 very small hand and assisting the, actually it's really less assisting and more like just like being homies with the Agnes Scott poetry team when the first year they went, you know, just being really, really close with them. But you know, so like really getting into collegiate spaces and like promoting environments where, you know, the kids there, and it's weird calling them kids because I'm only like, you know, a couple years older than a lot of them, but they're kids to me. Uh, but you know, promoting spaces for the kids there to like really explore perspectives and ideas that maybe they hadn't necessarily like realized that they were existing in, and or maybe they didn't realize they needed to talk about.
Right.
Um, you know, a lot of that. There was I again, the year prior to COVID, did a couple of shows with at like elementary schools and middle schools like that too. Oh my goodness, this keeps happening.
Is it about to go out again? Well, I still,
No,
but I guess they. Oh, okay, you're good.
yeah, no, I'm getting a call from somebody from work, I think, and
Oh,
so I will call them afterwards.
okay.
Um, yeah, so yeah, middle schools, yes. So performing at like, you know, middle schools and elementary schools, and like, so like introducing them to the art of spoken word,
Right.
um, you know, where I got contracted to do, you know, some of that. I did a couple of like workshops with middle school and high school students, um, in which, you know, we just go into the classroom and again allow them that space to write, you know, what they need to, or to just kind of like free themselves a little bit. So, you know, a lot of the workshops that I came up with kind of, you know, were silly too, where it's like you kind of need that. And then the same thing with community workshops. I've helped facilitate a few community workshops where, again, I think people don't realize, I think you kind of mentioned it before, that the process of writing about something can be healing toward, certain things. So, I mean, it's not a replacement for therapy, but it can be a nice complement too.
Right.
Um, and so, you know, I facilitating those workshops where, you know, people could, again, you know, come into the space and kind of like let go of some of the stuff that they were holding on to. And then to also like introduce them to like poetic form,
Yeah.
because it was a point in time where I was like really diving into poetic form and was like, okay, I'm learning this information. I really want to share this with other people. So, because I like the idea of like information and knowledge being something that's attainable by everyone and not necessarily like, I don't think there should be a bar for entry into certain like into like certain ideas and into like certain fields. So, and poetry definitely being one of those where it's like, okay, if I can write a poem, you should be able to write a poem, and regardless of whether or not other people think it's a good poem, you should still be able to write it. And so,
Kids that tool early on.
exactly,
So important.
yeah. And so that's kind of like where I was, you know, where I was kind of existing is trying to provide that space for people and to like kind of do that work. Um, and then yeah, to kind of add on to that too, on a political side, because I was writing political, like very like heavy political poems. You know, I kind of used that as like activism too, to
Mhm.
like, you know, exist in certain spaces and to like, again, I think to provide certain perspective that maybe communities were lacking, or you know, to kind of give a voice to certain perspective that like, you know, political organizations had. Like I performed at the ACLU a couple of times, you know, and yeah, they invited me to perform at their membership meeting, and you know, using that like as a platform to speak about certain ideas that they were already on, but like, you know, they needed to hear somebody else articulate it in a way that maybe they weren't necessarily able to.
Right.
um and then with like using it as a way to like, you know, enter into communities and kind of like provide a new perspective. One of the first shows I did when I was on poetry tour with Nate, um it was back in February of 2018, and it was like right before Black Panther came out, because I remember saying this on stage. We went to Eugene, Oregon, and if you know anything about the Pacific Northwest, is that there aren't a lot of Black people in the Pacific Northwest, and people assume that the Pacific Northwest isn't necessarily like racist or problematic or like biased because you know, they exist on the West Coast, and people tend to think more highly of the West Coast than they do here in the South, particularly because of history, right? Um, but I always make this joke, but because there are no Black people there to be racist to, you know, they can't be racist, right? You can't be racist to nobody. Right? Like there aren't enough of us there to be
Yeah.
racist too, right? And so like, you know, I when we went to Eugene, Oregon, I went and I did a show, or we went and we did a show, and I get up on stage and I'm like, yeah, I'm about to do this like series that I call like Blackness Sweet, and dedication to the second coming of Black Jesus. You know, Black Panther's coming out this week,
Mhm.
um, and like I do this like 10-minute like, you know, back to back to back to back to back reading of poems, and like, you know, we get a standing ovation on the show, but afterwards nobody speaks to me, nobody looks my direction, nobody like really shakes my hand unless I speak to, or you know, speak or shake their hand first, like
Yeah.
address them first. And so it's like, you know, it's like, oh, okay, word, y'all needed to hear the work that I was doing because this is how y'all treat people. Like I
Yeah.
see that, you know, and so, you know, yeah, I that's kind of what I mean when I say poetry, you know, dedicated to community outreach and to youth, you know, youth outreach and stuff like that. So trying to get poetry into the hands of the people who need it.
Yeah. And you said you say change, like just offer new perspectives, and another word for that too is just empathy. So
Right.
you showing what Black people uh like Black expression in a space where they've never experienced Black expression,
Right.
that does work.
Yeah.
Uh that
So
does.
to add on to that, I was in Canada, and not to go on tour experiences. I do this too much. My wife gets upset at me about it. We were in Canada at a show. This was in Victoria, British Columbia, and we're performing. And I do a bunch of poems or whatever about like Mike Brown, Eric Garner, early instances of police brutality, like in the 2010s. And this woman comes up to me afterwards, and I was weirded out by it at the time, because I was like, how dare you? But like, I get it, right? Where she came up to me and she was like, I have yet to meet anybody that's like a Black American. I haven't met anybody that's like Black from like the Southeast in particular, like from like basically like your part of the continent. And
Mm.
like, thank you for your perspective, because I didn't know I needed that. Right.
Right.
And so like, that's like, I was like off put when she said it to me, because I was like, I don't need you thanking me for being Black and existing. But at the same time, if I didn't give her that, that perspective, or allow her the space to be empathetic to my work, then, would she have ever experienced that? That's a question,
Yeah.
so.
There's a question with an answer, and it's no. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, right, exactly.
I am so thankful for your time. It's been a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah.
Where can people find you or your work?
Yeah. So I am at Go Home Ryan on everything. So at Go Home Ryan on Twitter, Instagram, and on Facebook. Um, I also used to run a poetry channel that still has like a bunch of my work up, called Homegrown Poetry on YouTube. So you can check that out. There are people who are still interested in doing that stuff, but I'm kind of removed from it a little bit. And yeah, I think that's primarily it. Yeah. So yeah, I'm Ryan J on YouTube too. So if you look up Ryan J Poetry, that some of my stuff should pop up. So yeah.
Yeah, it does.
Okay. Cool. I'm glad. Yeah.
Well, you really finished us out on such a great note. Um, that is the conclusion of Black Poetry Fest. Um, thank you, everyone, for sticking with us. Uh, and we will see y'all later in the world of poetry.
Thanks.